Quick, think of the 3 primary methods of hilt assembly in modern production swords. You got it in your mind? Did you come up with threaded and nut, and peened? Did you know there might be a 4th one that's actually potentially historically accurate? Any guesses as to what it is? So I've recently been playing Come Deliverance from Warhorse Studio. It's a new video game, it's an RPG based in the Middle Ages, and it strives to some extent to be historically accurate in how it portrays pretty much everything. And in the process of playing it on a live stream, I've honestly enjoyed more than anything the cutscenes and the dialogue and the acting. The story aspect of it has actually almost been better than the gameplay. Not that I'm a great game player anyway, but at the end of the day, there was something that really kind of surprised me, and I didn't really comment on it in the live stream because I didn't really want to stop and talk about this, and I also wanted to do a bit of research because it kind of surprised me. You see, they were going through the process of making a sword in these cutscenes, and they were doing a lot of things that are incredibly historically accurate. A good example of this is you have a bladesmith, he's making a sword blade, and the other parts of the sword, specifically the crossguard and the pommel, were actually being made separate. The hilt pieces, the hilt furniture, very often might be made by other tradesmen, people who more specialized in certain detailed work. This is especially true on something like Viking-era swords, but it was true throughout the Middle Ages. And actually is extremely true for more modern weapons such as a cutlass or a small sword. But all that being said, the process they went through in the game was actually pretty interesting. Your character Henry had to go collect the hilt components, and they met up with his father and they were going to go make the sword. They heated up the tang portion of the sword, got it red hot, and they used it to bore through the wooden handle. This is actually a thing that was done. In fact, it's not just was, it is done. If you ever watched a show like Forged in Fire, you'll actually see smiths do this with things like handles on a knife blade. They'll heat it up and they'll bore through a piece of wood. Sometimes they kind of pre-bore a hole, but they really work it in there and it burns out that wood and it gets a really nice snug fit. It's why it's done that way. It's also extremely dangerous. If you slip, it can be really, really bad. In fact, that's what I was thinking the entire time I was playing the game and watching this segment was, oh man, if he slips, he'll burn his hand, and he's not wearing gloves. Yeah, but it's a real process, and that was really cool to see them go through that process. And when they got it on there, when they kind of finished the handle piece and they slid it onto the tang, and I was like, this is great, they're going to put it all together. Some things didn't quite look right all of a sudden. The tang portion was barely sticking out as a nub at the end of the handle, and when his father then put the pommel on, it wasn't through a traditional peen method. It was through a method that's called wedged. See, you actually overbuild the tang for the size of the hole that is in the pommel, and then you beat that on there. And this wedging method is actually used in most swords in the modern period right now, as well as the Middle Ages, in things like crossguards. They would actually get the crossguard assembly to be just snug and tight enough that you have to kind of hammer it over onto the blade, so that even if you use it, that crossguard with all the compression really isn't probably going to become loose. Really high-end sword makers do this all the time. Yet doing it with a pommel seemed, well, quite honestly, a little bit odd, and I couldn't think at the time, and I was watching this, that was it actually ever done that way? And I started thinking back at all the historical examples I've seen in museums, and well, they're all pretty much peened. And I know that threaded pommels and threaded tangs were actually somewhat common very, very late in the process of making a lot of swords. Certainly maybe not as common as something like the Middle Ages. And variations of how you constructed swords changed from region to region and from smith to smith. So some people might choose to use a boring method for the grip, but some people might not. They might choose to use some sort of sandwiching method where they have 2 separate pieces and they sandwich over the tang for that grip. But to see the pommel just kind of knocked on there was really strange, and I thought it was really odd they chose that instead of showing the process of having the tang come out the end of the pommel and putting something like a peen block on and then hammering it down. And I was so shocked about this because, honestly, in my mind, that's how historical swords were always made, more or less. I did a lot of internet sleuthing over the past couple days after having seen this, and I found a couple of references to historical models of using a wedged fit as a compress fit for the pommel, but it seems to be very rare, and again, I haven't seen any museum examples of this. In fact, it seems like everything pretty much is a peened example, and peens are one of the best ways to ensure a nice tight fit, and along with other things such as keying on the tang, which is where the tang is fit in a certain way into the handle piece that can only really fit in one way, and it stays very snug, and when you peen it all together it compresses and it all holds, and holds for a very long time. But okay, let's assume that this wedge method is actually valid. Let's assume that it can be done that way. Why does no one do that today? Would it actually hold up all that well? See, I think that if you use a wedging method, you're inevitably going to have a sword that will fall apart after some level of abuse, after some level of use, because as you use a sword and as it beats and as it vibrates and all these components that fit really snugly slowly come apart and begin to rattle, well, the last thing you want is your pommel flying off one direction and your blade flying off the other direction, and you're left holding just the wooden core grip and the cross guards falling at your feet. What are you going to do in a fight then? It seems really odd that Warhorse chose to show this methodology, and I think it might be partially driven out of just limitations on the purposes of the cutscene, but it does seem really odd. And a lot of people have had debates about whether or not peens were ever just done as cold peens. That is, the part of the tang that sticks out that you hammer down isn't actually heated. We know that that's really done very often in the modern method because we have things like blow torches just to heat up that one section. Interestingly enough, some people who have looked at some of the history of this stuff suggest that, well, there is something like a ye old blowtorch that's done out of a hole in a furnace that allows a very, very fine hot stream of fire and heat to heat up just that part of the tang. But even so, cold peening is actually a very common practice, and probably was, especially in the Middle Ages, because, well, honestly, it's the blade portion that tends to be heat treated and tempered a lot more, and the tang was usually a lot more soft, and you could actually hammer that down and mushroom it out and get that good compression even without the heat. Now, the heat adds a lot to it. It makes it a lot better, but it wasn't necessarily strictly needed. But I found it really odd that Warhorse did this. I found it really odd that it was in this cutscene. And I found it really odd because if I was watching this, thinking about historically accurate swords I've seen, this is actually the furthest thing from it. I don't know if this was really done historically. I can't find any evidence of it. I'm actually making this video because I'm hoping someone can point me to something to actually inform me about this, well, fourth method of, constructing a sword and putting all the pieces together. Because without some knowledge, without some information that suggests to me that this is a valid method that meets all the criteria for a sword holding together, I'm going to call shenanigans. I don't think it's a good way to make a sword. I've also been racking my brain about exactly what this would do and how you could actually make it work and what some of the pitfalls are of it. One thing I thought of is that maybe if you bore out parts of that pommel to be a certain shape and that it keys onto part of that tang that sticks out, and as you hammer it in, it actually kind of forces a mushroom to happen within the pommel, that it would still hold very snug and secure. This is things that are done in things such as woodworking, actually, where you actually make components that fit together, but in the process of actually putting them together, they actually spread out and lock into place. But I think that'd be very hard to do with steel, especially if it's not kind of superheated to be able to be a lot more malleable. On top of that, it also makes this sword, a sword done this way, very, very limited in its ability for reuse. What happens if you break the blade of the sword? Well, you want to get all these hilt pieces off so you can reuse them on the next blade. It's a very common thing to be done with swords, especially in the Middle Ages, but we do it in the modern time all the time as well. People who collect and mess with swords, we grind off a peen, or we undo the threaded pommel, and we redo all the hilt components and get a new blade and put it back together and play some magical game of sword Tetris to make all these things fit together and work again as some sort of brand new sword. But if you'd assembled it with this weird pommel in this way, would that really work? Would it hold together all that well? I don't really know that it would, or that being able to take it apart would really work, because how do you grind? You're gonna have to grind off the tang. You have to cut that handle in half, and then you're not really using all those components. And this has been driving me insane for a couple of days. It really has. Also, what would you do with a hollow pommel? See, most people don't realize this, but pommels are not very often, but they can be hollow. A good example of this would be actually this sword that came with the Kingdom Come Deliverance Collector's Edition. It has a hollow pommel, or at least I imagine it's a hollow pommel because of the way the weight is distributed, and it also has these coins in it. And usually when you have pommels have coins, it's probably a hollow pommel. Well, if it's hollow, how can you ensure that this wedging method, this compression method, would actually hold without bending in parts of the metal of the pommel? It just doesn't seem like a very good method. It actually seems like the worst method. And here I thought a threaded pommel was the worst method, but there you go. I guess I've been proven wrong. End of the day, I think it's strange. I haven't talked a lot about historical accuracy or inaccuracies in this game. I won't talk a lot about historical accuracies and inaccuracies. I don't really enjoy that. I like to enjoy a game for what it is. I don't necessarily feel like there's a lot of interest in calling out all the inaccuracies. I think most people can apply some logic to some of them. But there are some very interesting things this game has done, but this is just a weird one, guys. It's really weird, and it's been bothering me. So there you go. Magic fourth method, maybe, for assembling a sword. I'm really going to start keeping a closer eye at museums at whether or not I see a peen on a sword, because I think I've always seen it being peened. I don't think I've ever seen any other method, and it's just befuddling to me, so I'm really curious. So, hey, if you know of an example of this, of just using a compression method, what's called wedging, let me know. I would love to know if this is actually a thing, and if it is, great. I'd like to make a video on it, and maybe even find a sword or a maker who can make me one that is of that example. Anyway, I thought it was interesting. I thought it was a unique thing to talk about, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Cheers, guys.